All right, so let's talk a little bit about automated testing in Rails. Um, so I gave an example in the previous video of that we could write code to test our code. And it's a nice idea. Basically, we have these classes, we have these methods, and again, we understand the idea of, all right, for this input, I know the output should be this, so let me write code to pass input like that in, run the code, get the result, and check the result. And does it work as expected? And have all that checking be done with code. But there are some downsides to just trying to write that on your own. And testing frameworks solve a lot of sort of tedious but also important operational problems for us. So in Rails, the default testing framework is Minitest. Today, I'm just going to give a super quick intro to it, enough that hopefully you can get an idea for what it does, and so that you could possibly look at the tests that I'm going to give you for homework 7, so that you could see, oh, well, I understand what he's doing with the testing. All right. Again, the expectation is not for you to be like, oh, I'm going to start doing automated testing for my final project. You'll do lots of automated testing in 342. I still think it would probably be easier for you in 245 with your final project to be testing things manually. All right, so again, I said it's a testing framework. It's enabled by default. There are other testing frameworks. Some people really like to use RSpec, but Minitest, I mean, even its name, Mini, I mean, it keeps things nice and simple, and I really like that. And it works really well. And it provides, in Rails, we have 3 different levels to test things at. And these are really the 3 levels you're ever going to want to have for most programs and systems that you build. The first level, the lowest level actually, is unit testing. And this is where we test individual methods, we test objects, but that's it. It's constrained to that sort of functionality, and we isolate the object and its methods from other objects and methods as much as possible so that we can just know that this part works correctly. It might be like, let's say you're working on a car as a mechanical engineer, and yeah, we fully tested these ball bearings. They're working great. It's just one small part of the car. Or, oh yeah, no, we've tested the brake pad material and it works like this. But you haven't tested as part of the larger system. That would be unit testing. The controller level we can test at. This allows us to drive our application with the HTTP requests. And so we can post data, we can get data, patch and delete, and we can drive the application that way, which is the same sort of requests that our browser will produce, but we can directly produce those requests and run it through the code. And so at that level, when we tested a controller, the controller will, be talking to models and things. It won't be the entire application when we write a single test. All right, but it'll cover a lot more than the unit test will. But basically, we do get to basically drive most of the app also this way. What we're not testing at the controller level, though, is the user interface. All right, so we aren't using the interface to produce input at the controller level, nor are we really paying attention to the results, us formulating this HTML and sending it back, where it's all just sort of paying attention to the internals. But at the system level, we're able to do end-to-end testing, where we do these large actions, through the user interface, and we're actually taking the HTML, and there's code, and there's great libraries to help us with this. But basically, again, they'll find links in the page, they'll click the links, Those requests will go into our testing system and our application. We can receive forms back. We can fill the form out even and post data. It tests the whole system from one end to the other end. Today we're going to look at unit testing, a brief introduction to it, because that's the type of testing that was done in an automated fashion for homework 7. All right, so okay. So the example we had been using was calculating the average rating for a book. And so at the unit testing level, we make a test. We make basically a class, usually for testing that matches the class that we want to test. So we have a book class in our system, and so we want a class that's associated with the book in our testing world. So we're going to make another class for testing the book, and we're going to call it book test, actually. And so what we do in Minitest is, so basically to do unit testing, we make a class that inherits from active support : test case. This actually inherits from Minitest, and normally we make one test class for every class we want to test, or we want to unit test. So to test the book class, we're going to do the following. So we're going to have we're going to make an example here. And the file that we're going to do, we put all of our testing work inside of the test directory in Rails. And so you saw in homework 8, actually, you went into this directory, and I had added, actually, it's not a default directory there. All the default directories are for automated testing, but I added a manual directory, and we put in there test cases so that we could write out manual test cases and keep track of them. But our automated tests for unit testing are associated with our models, goes in test/models, and then we can have classes that we want to do. We'll have a whole bunch of different files. We're going to test the book model, and so I'm going to make a class which is for testing the book, a book class, and we'll name the file book_test. All right, so that's the file that now I'm going to be editing. So let's start a fresh whiteboard to edit that file. All right, to edit that file, at the top of this book test RB, we write require test helper, and this brings in the code. So this brings in the code that is located at test/test helper.rb, and in there you'll see an existing class and things that it will actually see the active support test case, I believe, class, and we can add things to that class as necessary so that all of our automated tests will inherit from it. So this is where we bring that in, and it brings in a lot of other framework material as well. It lets us run Minitest basically. So then we go and we're going to make our new class book test. So note again in Rails, we do the file name in snake case, and we do the class name in camel case. And we're going to inherit from, as I said, active support. : test case. All right. So in Minitest classes, so this is what we're writing now, they are just simply Ruby classes, so that's great. So you can write anything Ruby in here, and it's just absolutely fine. The way it works is when we want to run tests, we put one test per method, and we always name that method beginning with test underscore. So let's say, for example, I want to test the average rating with multiple ratings. So I go and I can define a new method. So test underscore is the way I start it. Any method in here that I write that starts with test underscore, when I later run my testing framework, it will know to call this method and to run the code in it. This is the way I capture one test case. Okay, and we make a method per test case. All right. So this one, and we give it a useful name so that when results are reported, we know what we're testing. So I'm going to test average rating, and I'm going to be doing multiple ratings. All right, and it doesn't take any arguments. So it's just a nice long name. But it has to start with test underscore so that the framework knows, this is one of your tests that you want me to run. So because this is just Ruby, and this is all just integrated with part of Rails, we can access anything in our application. So we can access all our models and active records and things like that. An important thing to remember with Minitest is when this test gets run, when we start running this code, the test database is empty. There's nothing in it except for our tables. So the schema will be in there, but it will have no seed data in it. Okay, so we'll have all our tables, so all our models could work, but there's no data in it. And every single test that I write, so every single method in the whole framework, that's the way the database will start for every single one of it. Whatever I do to the database inside of this method, when this method ends, will be cleaned out so that there's a fresh slate for the next test. We don't want our tests to be dependent upon each other. We want them to work independently. All right, so that's an important thing, but that means there's no data in the database. And I want to test average rating on my book class, so I need to get a book into the database, and I need to give it some ratings so that I can actually call average rating on that book and see if I produce the right result. So for example, I could absolutely go ahead and do the following, which is I could go and say, all right, I'm going to make this variable card, and I'm going to call my author model class to create a new author. And all we need to do to create the new author is give the author a name and Orson Scott Card. All right. So that'll actually go into the test database. So the good books underscore test database, whatever it's exactly named, not the development database, but the test database, which is empty except for the schema in it. And it'll now go, and the first author it'll make will be Orson Scott Card, and I've got that author object now returned to me and in that variable card. All right, so now I can go make myself a book. Let's make Ender's Game. And so I call book.new. Oh, let's not do new, let's do create, sorry. Get this done in one fell stroke. All right, and great. My handwriting here, I'm having trouble. Great. Title, and we set that to be Ender's Game. I mean, we don't necessarily have to be perfect in this because it is just test data, and my test doesn't really depend upon the title or the year, but we have to have them, otherwise it won't be able to build it, especially we need the author. All right, so that'll make us our book. Now we have that in Ender's Game. And now I could show you, but basically what we need to do here is we need to add ratings, okay? Which of course means we also need users. So there's quite a bit of, I have to build up the test case in the database, all right? But I have to do that. And so I do all of that. I'm building up all this data. And then in Minitest, there are all sorts of special methods for making, remember with unit testing and all testing in general, we have this arrange, act, assert. So what I'm doing here is I'm arranging, I'm adding the data that's necessary, the input that's necessary to be able to run my test. Then I need to act, I need to call my method, okay? And then I need to assert that and check whether or not the results returned by my method match my expected results. And so in Minitest and most testing frameworks, there are lots of specialized assert methods. And the purpose of these is for us to say, I basically have these expected results and I got these actual results. Are they equal? If not, testing framework, please report to me when I run you as part of the framework that my test has failed. If it does match, report that my test has passed. And the testing framework will keep track of this stuff and report it nicely for us. So that's wonderful. So we have to use the special assert methods that come with whatever testing framework that we have. Now, for Minitest, for comparing floating point numbers, there's a special assert for us. Remember we talked about that testing equality with floating point numbers is tricky. And so it does actually have this method called assert in delta. And on Ender's Game, assuming I put in the same data we had with the seed database, I'm going to expect to get back an average of 2.33. Again, I'm only going out to the thousandth place. So that's what's expected. And then my actual results are going to be, well, I'm going to have the book, Ender's Game, dot, I'll call average rating on it. Now, how close do I want them to be? I want them to be within a delta of 0.001. And then I want to give a message if it's not. And so I can supply this and I could write it should return 2.333 for Ender's Game. So a nice helpful message if it does not actually pass the test. And so we can do this assert, and it's this is a method call. If you wanted, I could put parentheses around these. All right, and so that's what's expected. This is the actual result that happens after I've set up all the data. I want it to be within 1,000th of this. And here's a message if I failed. It can be helpful to see that. Then that's the end of that method. Wonderful. Absolutely great. Okay, let's write another test case, the one for nil. So I'd continue with that class. All right, just a moment. All right, so let's continue our book class. I'm sorry, our book test. Our book test class. And we're gonna write our method now inside a test case for when we have no ratings. So again, we start with test underscore. We say what it is that we're testing. We're going to test average rating and with no ratings. And this, everything after the test underscore is all just being informative. The fact that I'm saying average rating here isn't special. It's just an informative message. All right. So we need to go and set up some data. So again, at the start of this method, there's nothing in the database. Each test that we write is designed to be independent of every other test. We don't rely upon another test leaving some data around for us or leaving a certain state of things. Every test needs to be independent and self-contained, and the framework helps us do that by wiping away and resetting the database basically back to an empty slate. But it has no data in it, so we got to put some data in it to test things. So we're going to make Agatha Christie. It's our author. Yes. Create. Name. Agatha Christie. Not too many people named Agatha anymore. All right, so that gives us the author. And now let's make a book. 5 pigs. Give it a title. Give it a year. And give it its author. Okay, so now we've set up this. Nice thing about this test is I can actually show you all the data. We've got a book. It's made, has no ratings. I don't need to do anything more. That's the whole point. I want a book with no ratings. So that's a book with no ratings. And so now, and I have a different special assert when I want to make sure. So again, average rating for the book, when we call average rating on it with no ratings, is to return nil. And I have a different special assert for when I want to check nil. And so I go and I say assert nil. The most basic assert statement is just assert. And you assert and you give it the expected, comma, and the actual. And you're basically asserting, the most basic one is assert. And you're asserting that whatever you give it should be true. The next most used one is assert equal, and you give it an expected and the actual, and it checks to see if they're equal, and if they're not equal, you failed your assertion. But so I'm asserting that this should be nil. So I'm asserting that when I call 5 pigs dot average rating that this guy will be nil. And if I wanted to, I could do comma and write a nice message that says, you know, something about it should return nil for 5 picks. Okay, but this basically, so long as this expression returns nil, I will pass that assertion. That's my only assertion in that test. So that's one complete test now. And it'll get called, and if it passes, it'll print out, by default, it actually only prints out a nice little tiny period. If it fails, though, it'll print it out in bright red as an error or a failure message that this test has not passed. All right, and so this could then be the end of my book test method. Not method, sorry, class. Let's talk about some other things about this. Oh, first of all, how to run my tests. So back in the terminal at the root of my Rails app, so this is where, you know, again, I CD into good books, so that's the root of that. Now I can run at the terminal. To run the test, I do Rails test. This will run my unit and my controller tests. Right now I only have unit tests. It's helpful to get when we have so few tests, it's helpful for it to be a bit more verbose in what it's telling you. When you have thousands of tests, you actually only care about the ones that don't pass, and so it doesn't print much out. But if you do verbose, you'll actually get nice green messages about test average rating, no ratings, passing in green. It's quite nice. So we do that, and again, it'll run, and we'll get output that if it's in green, we've passed. If it's red, we've failed. When we fail, it tells us a nice message about why we failed. If we write buggy code, it'll fail because we have bad code, and we'll get a nasty message saying you've written bad code, basically. Fix your code. Your test it can't pass if it's got broken code. All right, so that's the way you run it. Well, now other things to note about Minitest, okay? Here we go. So things to note. It's not a very well written things to note about Minitest. All right. I've already mentioned this, but we'll put it on the board. Only methods that start with test underscore are run as tests. So these are all sort of entry points. Each one of them will be run as a test. But you should absolutely note it's just a class. So you can write other methods in the class and call them. So if testing involves something complex, we know it's nice to break things up into methods. Or maybe there's something you want to call that's used by many different tests. You can just write another method for that. And so long as you don't begin it with test underscore, it won't get automatically called. It's just that you can call it then. Again, I mentioned you have access to all of Rails. Okay. So we can create data and whatever we want to do. In there, we can access the routes, the helper methods, all sorts of things we can have access to. By the way, because it's just Ruby, you can stick bybug in test to debug the test. Okay, you can stick bybug anywhere and it works. It's beautiful. I've already said this, but let's remind you, each test should be written to be independent of other tests of note. The database, this is the test database, is wiped clean after each test. And that's not after the whole class, it's after every little individual test method. Okay? Now, you could envision that maybe we want to set up a fair amount of data for our test. Maybe something more on the order of our seed data. All right. And so you can, and we'd like it to be available for every test. So one of the ways we can do that is we can put code that's to be run before each test in a class in a method named setup, which makes a lot of sense. So you do def setup, so you define a method setup, and whatever you write in that method, well, that method will be called first before your test method is called. So it's not called once for the class, it's called before every single test method in that class. And so you can have different setups for different classes. All right. Likewise, your test, as you saw, inherits from active support test case, which is in test/test helper.rb. So you can add methods to this class to be inherited for all of your tests, your unit and your controller tests. There's a separate one. Actually, maybe, no, that one, this one is for all of the tests. Yep. So for example, in the homework 7 tests, I wrote a method in this special class to set up data. And then I call that method in the setup of my book test because I just wanted to create, just like the C did, a whole bunch of data for testing. So I put it all in one method and I call it, and it builds all this testing data for me. Okay. Okay. I've already mentioned this. There are lots of ways to do an assert. You got to just go read the docs for this. There's one page and it lists all the different ways, and they're all named in very sensible fashion. All right. So that's basically the brief introduction to Minitest. I want to stress again that you are not in any way expected to be doing any automated testing for your final project. You should, though, be thinking of this mindset of what do I need to do to verify that my work matches the specification. So you need to think about the different sort of types of input and the expected output, and then verify that your application actually does that. And you can be helped by working, you can do it, of course, at the user interface level. You could do some things at the console level. When you find problems, go stick PyBug wherever you need it and use it to help you understand the problems. Okay, you don't have a good way to print things out to the console, all right, when you run these programs. So the way to find out what the values are of stuff is to put bybug in there, and it acts like a breakpoint, and then it'll give you control, and you can print out the values and you can see what things are. That's the biggest way that's used. You can also step through things and do other sorts of stuff. But the biggest thing is to get your code to stop at a certain point and evaluate and print out values. All right, so that's our super brief introduction to Minitest, combined with the brief introduction to testing. This gives you a good sense of how to start thinking about your apps, and as well when I make the post to Campus Wire about Homework 7, when you look at the tests, you should have some sense of, that's how these work because you watched this lecture. All right.